I'm Kim Conhauser-Freeman. I'm Executive Director of the Women's Foreign Policy Group, and we work to promote the voices of women in foreign policy through international issues programs like today. And I'm so glad you're all able to join us. Thank you. And thank you to the Embassy of Qatar for helping to sponsor this event, so thank you. Tonight we're here to discuss priorities and challenges for the Gulf, peace, security, and mitigating conflict, certainly a very timely topic. We're here with Her Excellency Lolwah I'm going to try and get this right, Al-Khater, spokeswoman for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the State of Qatar, and Ambassador Ann Patterson. Welcome back. Her Excellency Al-Khater was appointed as spokeswoman of the ministry in 2017, and she's actually the first person to hold this role. So the position was created in 2017. She's been the face of the ministry during a very tumultuous time in diplomatic relations, to say the least, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that. She's a public policy expert and brings her experience in government as well as academia to the post. Tonight's moderator is a WFPG member, Ambassador Ann Patterson, who served as Assistant Secretary of State for the Middle East and North Africa from 2013 to 2017, and as well as Ambassador to Egypt, Pakistan, Colombia, and El Salvador. So we're very lucky to have her here to guide our conversation today. I was just going to say, please welcome, join me in welcoming today's speaker. So we already did that.
So, good evening, everyone. I would like to seize this opportunity to express my gratitude to the kind invitation by the Women's Foreign Policy Group. And certainly, I'm very honored to be with Ambassador Patterson this evening. Looking forward to a very dynamic discussion about women, governance, and the many crises, obviously, that we have in our region. But I think it's also a chance to think a little bit more about the role of women and governance beyond the lens of women empowerment. I think we have so much to bring to the table beyond our very specific issues. Sometimes it has been proven, I think, beyond doubt, that there is a serious global crisis when it comes to the lack of leadership. People have been pushed to a corner where they have somehow to choose between sub-nationalistic identities sometimes and more of a global outlook. And I don't think that this has to be a trade-off. I think it could be a nice and creative blend of both. And here, if I may just draw on one example that I've seen in action a few years back when I visited Scotland, and I had the chance to interact with some officials there, including their youngest minister, who was at the time 20 years old, Scottish, Muslim, of Asian origins, and interestingly enough, he was part of the National Party in Scotland. And at the time, he talked a lot about civic nationalism. And to me, that was the first time ever that I heard that term. What is civic nationalism? I mean, if you think about it in the context of Scotland, this is a nation that has been trying and striving to create its own identity in a way that is distinctive from its immediate surrounding, that is, and I would say natural organic depth, that is the rest of the UK. And you would think that this would push the society to a more kind of specific sub-identity choices. But the choice there was a very interesting and creative one to talk about civic nationalism. And this kind of inspired my imagination that maybe there are other options that are yet to be explored for us as human beings collectively. And I connect this back to women and the role of women and feminism in its broadest sense, to bring something different, something creative, something unique to the table?
Thank you, Ambassador, and let me say what a pleasure it is to have you here. This is a very distinguished group and one of the few groups that is entirely nonpartisan in its experience and outlook. So the founder there, Pat Ellis, has done a great job. So we're very happy to be here tonight, and I think we'll have a good discussion. I do want to get to some of the issues about women in the Middle East, but I thought I'd start off with the Gulf because it's undergone a strategic transformation, in my view, in the past few years. First, there's the young prince, Mohammed bin Salman, who has totally upended the situation in Saudi Arabia. The murder of Jamal Khashoggi and the war in Yemen have, I think, perhaps forever changed the U.S.-Saudi relationship. Qatar's neighbors announced a boycott in June, and Egypt announced a boycott in June 2017. And they accused Qatar of colluding with terrorists, of letting Al Jazeera run amok. But in my view, some of the most damaging or the worst accusations were things like the Bahrainis accusing Qatar of inciting the Shia population. There were rumors that the UAE and Saudi Arabia were planning to invade Qatar, or at least get rid of the royal family and impose a proxy more to their liking. And I have seen over the last few years a more aggressive foreign policy by Qatar. Once when I was in Egypt, an Egyptian official expressed great dismay that the Qataris were trying to take over the Arab League. But generally, Qatar was seen as a challenge to some of the regional heavyweights. So I'd like to ask you some questions about sort of the overall situation. First, how does Qatar see the blockade? Do you see any potential for resolving the blockade? The administration, General Zinni, the Emir of Kuwait have worked strenuously on this with no results. And how do you see it resolving, if at all?
Thank you. If you allow me to just comment on the introduction. When this crisis, the GCC crisis, what we call the blockade of Qatar, others may call, call it an embargo, whatever you want to call it. When June 5th, 2017 happened, many actors globally thought that this was, just yet another conflict in Arabia, right? It's a tribal thing between countries, it's very remote, and it wasn't until a series of events happened that people realized that this is really beyond just Qatar and Saudi, or Qatar and United Arab Emirates, or Qatar and Egypt. This was about a number of actors in the region who are unfortunately applying policies that are very far from rationality, to say the least. We've seen what happened to the Lebanese Prime Minister, and honestly, that was the first shift that we witnessed here in DC, because when it happened, we were with the minister in a visit, and suddenly the narrative about the entire situation changed. And suddenly officials, congressmen started asking us questions. Things like, how do you assess the situation in Lebanon? We really think that what's happening to Lebanon is what happened with Qatar, and so on and so forth. And at the time, the war in Yemen was not perceived as an item that would make it to the top of the agenda in the States at the time. But it was picking a momentum in the UK, in Europe, and recently, of course, in the US. And Yemen is another case. And then, of course, what happened to Jamal Khashoggi, and so on and so forth. So once again, I urge everyone, when they look at the GCC crisis, the blockade of Qatar, to look at it through that lens, that it's been the same actors who created this totally manufactured situation with Qatar, unnecessary. They're the same actors who are applying many other impulsive policies in the region, unfortunately. Now, to your question, Ambassador, the prospects of a solution are unfortunately not very promising. The chances are thin, simply because our neighbors haven't been responding to the many calls that the Kuwaitis have been making. Also here in the States, many officials have called upon all parties to come back to the table of negotiations. None of that has been answered. We're still open to a dialogue, even a back channel. Anything that would get a serious conversation to start and happen.
Let me ask you a variant of this, and that's Qatar's relations with Iran, because ostensibly one of the motivators for this blockade was the Iranian issue, and obviously this administration has taken a very different tone on Iran than the previous did, the withdrawal from the nuclear agreement. And obviously they see Iran as a threat in Yemen and Syria and Iraq and Lebanon. And I would say, from what I've seen, I don't speak for this administration, of course, but the highest priority in the Middle East is to contain Iran. Now, this puts Qatar in a very difficult position, and I'd like you to comment on your relations with Iran. One, you have this enormous shared gas field. Second, basically, if it comes to a conflict between Israel and Iran, or the U.S. and Iran, the U.S. bases in Bahrain and Kuwait, but particularly in Qatar, will be hugely vulnerable. And what would Qatar's reaction to that be? And then finally, I presume you're still dependent on food shipments from Iran because the overland route from Saudi Arabia has been closed. So I think you're in potentially a bind on the Iranian issue, and I'd like to understand better your relations with Iran and how you could resolve some of these issues.
So when this crisis erupted, there was zero diplomatic relations between Qatar and Iran. No ambassadors, no diplomatic ties. So all this crisis did, assuming that the claim about, the Qatar-Iran alleged, special relationship, assuming that this was part of it, all this conflict did was actually to push us closer to Iran. So this conflict has been very much counterintuitive to its at least declared objectives. And of course, we question whether this rhetoric about Iran is a genuine reason. And I see this given a number of indicators. One, if anyone does a simple content analysis of the discourse that comes out of these countries, they change the narrative depending on the audience, right? So sometimes it's terrorism, and sometimes it's Iran, and sometimes it's something else, and so on and so forth, right? So this double discourse, for us, shows very clearly that this is to serve as a distractor, as a smokescreen to the real reasons behind the blockade. Now, the relationship between Qatar and Iran today, of course, we restored the diplomatic ties simply because the only passage we have is through Iran. So, we have, our land borders have been completely closed. Sky, sea, likewise. And 90% of our food and medicine used to come through Saudi and United Arab Emirates. 90% of that. The only passage we have today is through Iran. And yet the question is, what is the trade between Qatar and Iran? Between Qatar and Iran. It's worth monthly $100 million only. That's because we get the goods through Iran and not from Iran. They come from other countries, but through Iran. Now the question is, what's the trade between our neighbor, United Arab Emirates, and Iran monthly? It is $20 billion. And we've been always wondering, why is it that Qatar always gets criticized, and for some reason, United Arab Emirates gets away with it, if you want to put it this way. And of course, I mean, there is a huge gap between rhetoric and reality when it comes to their stance towards Iran. And let me remind everyone that only a couple of months after this crisis erupted, Minister of Interior in Iraq at the time, Minister Al-A'raji, met with Mohammed bin Salman, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, and after that made two public statements saying that Prince Mohammed bin Salman asked Iraq to mediate between Saudi and Iran. So once again, I think we need to take a closer look at the relationship here and the dynamics of what's happening in the region.
Yeah, Ambassador, I guess personally I fear that the whole sectarian conflict, the conflict between Sunni and Shia, is going to play out in a most unfortunate way. And I think, of course, we've seen that over the years, and particularly in Iraq, but also in Syria and other places. Is there some potential, is there some mechanism? I think it would be hard for Qatar to do a back channel, but is there some mechanism that can be used to mediate between these countries? I actually think neither Saudi Arabia nor Iran probably want a conflict with each other. Is there some way this sort of overarching problem can begin to be resolved?
That's a very, very good question. And the answer is yes. There is always a way to resolve conflicts. And almost every war that we know of in our modern history ended up at the table of negotiations somehow. So let's be smart about this, and before we enter just another violent, turn, let's just go back to our senses, all of us collectively, and think about our differences and talk about mediating our differences. And Qatar is always willing to play that role in terms of mediation.
One issue I wanted to talk to you about was Israel, and that shouldn't surprise you because it would come up, I think, in most events of this sort in Washington. Now, Qatar was one of the first Arab countries, maybe the first, to have a trade office. It opened in 94 or 95, I think, and closed as a result of the Second Intifada. And over the years, I've seen certainly that many Arab countries have had discreet contacts with Israeli security and intelligence officials. But I wanted to basically ask you two questions. One about the World Cup, because this is where I've heard a lot of discussion. Can Israelis come to the World Cup? Can they participate? I know there have been a few incidents with Israeli athletes in Qatar. And why doesn't Qatar actually is working closely with the Israelis in Gaza? Why doesn't Qatar just bite the bullet and establish diplomatic relationships with Israel? I've seen, I think there's a generational change, and a lot of Arabs are sort of losing interest in the Palestinian cause.
Well, to that last comment, I'm not sure. Maybe we need to run a survey, but yes, Qatar did start diplomatic ties with Israel in 1996, as a matter of fact. Yeah. And that was in the spirit of the peace process. Oslo, Wadi Araba, with Jordan, and so on and so forth. And there was a trade office, an Israeli trade office in Qatar. It wasn't until 2008, when the first war on Gaza started, that Qatar actually closed down the office. Yet, I mean, Qatar still has some communication, as you know, especially in terms of pledging some aid to Gaza, and not only Gaza, honestly, Gaza and West Bank. It's both of them significant developmental projects are happening there. Qatar played a role in the mediation process as well. It is still willing to play that role. However, we need to remember that there was an Arab peace initiative that was put forward 2002. People tend to forget that. It was the Arab League Summit 2002 in Beirut. Late King Abdullah of Saudi, he proposed to for all Arab countries to normalize ties, all of them with no exception, with Israel. In return, their Oslo would be implemented, right? It was a very simple, straightforward formula. Oslo to be implemented, two-state solution to be realized, and diplomatic ties, normalization will happen, will take place. That initiative, as you know, Ambassador, was never responded to. It has been never answered by the Israelis. So our understanding of the situation is that in principle, any relationship between any Arab country and Israel should be a facilitator for the peace process, for a lasting and a just peace deal, if you wish, for all parties and for the Palestinians. Unfortunately, we don't see signs or indicators that this will happen anytime soon. As you know, there is a problem with settlements. A two-state solution is no longer viable in the sense that you have Gaza on the one hand, the West Bank, and geographically they're separated completely. And how can you have a state when the two parts of your state are completely separated? And they're separated because of settlements, right? So Qatar is completely for two-state solution, 1967 borders, the right for refugees to go back, and East Jerusalem as a capital. And this is really in compliance with all UN resolutions. This is in compliance with what the UN has been, asking for, European Union, really everyone. The international community agreed on these basic things. It's just a matter of implementing them.
I'm going to ask you a question you might not want to answer because of the diplomatic discussions, but when Mr. Jared Kushner came to your country to basically pitch his peace plan, and I'm certain asked for money to support it with the Palestinians, what did you say?
Well, you made many assumptions in the question, so I don't necessarily approve of all of them or agree. Yet our answer is what I just said. I mean, a solution that is compliant with international law, UN resolutions, something that is aligned with what the international community has agreed on, European Union, etc. Our position is really no different from the position of Germany or the UK or the European Union or most countries, I would say.
The World Cup is coming to Qatar in 2022, and I wanted to ask you about these reports that have been very prevalent in the press about abuse of workers, many of which have been involved in construction projects on the World Cup. Qatar has about 300,000 native citizens and over 2 million guest workers, and this has both a human rights element, but it also has an economic element because American companies work hard to be sure and spend money to be sure their workers are taken care of and don't want to compete with those that don't. So I'd like to know, I know that Qatar has taken some steps on this. I'd like to know what Qatar is doing to improve the condition of these workers, and then particularly what steps Qatar would take on domestic workers. That's one of the hardest to supervise because it's very difficult to get in the home and it's very difficult to have some kind of monitoring on that.
Absolutely. Thank you for the opportunity to elaborate on this. One of the most recent reports has been the Amnesty International report, and they did call upon the government of Qatar to take more measures, enforcement, etc. We went publicly, welcomed the report. As a matter of fact, we keep welcoming not only Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, all human rights groups are welcome to come to Qatar, because we believe that this is a transparent way to give us honest feedback, because we're very open to reform and change things. We realize that there is a lot to be done, but there has been a lot that, that's already done. Anyone who has visited Doha knows this. I mean, even before the World Cup, we launched our 2030 vision. I know that 2030 is now associated with certain countries, certain contexts, but when we launched it, that was 2008, before, any of this has happened. So 2008, right in the vision, in the very beginning, there is a pillar called human development. And in there, you see guest workers. Not only human development for Qataris, but also for the guest workers. So there was always this realization that this part of the society is the most vulnerable. We realize this for a number of reasons. And many of them have nothing to do with the policies, but also with many small and medium companies. And this is a serious problem, I totally agree. So Qatar, ever since, has been changing its policies, has been trying to respond to the needs of the guest workers, because at the end of the day, these people are helping us to build our country, and they are to be honored and appreciated. No question about that. So the exit permit abolished, minimum wage, the policies there still needs enforcement. Every company that has workers now has to create bank accounts for every single worker to make sure that they receive their wages in a timely manner. Many of these measures are already in place. Enforcement remains a big question, not because there is no will from the side of the government, but because it takes time to trickle down. But also to respond to that, we have introduced things like hotlines and also more awareness and education. So just to give you one example, many of these guest workers don't speak Arabic or English, or very poor English. So they face many difficulties and challenges, for example, in hospitals. And that's why when you go to Qatar now, all the signage, you will see other languages, especially Asian languages. Not only that, Qatar opened so far 7 offices in the sending countries. Because, by the way, this abuse process, and I call it a process, it's a chain that starts in the countries, the sending countries. Many of these people come to Qatar in debt already. So part of the proactive policy that Qatar is trying to do is to open offices there to raise awareness, so that when people apply, it's a transparent process. No one is taking advantage of them. Is there much that needs to be done yet? Yes, of course, always. But once again, we're very open to constructive criticism, such as what I just heard, Ambassador, such as what Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch are providing. As a matter of fact, it's a homegrown human rights entity, the national human rights entity in Qatar. Please, I do urge you to consult their yearly reports. They're very transparent. They talk about all of these problems and issues.
Thank you. I wanted to ask a couple questions too before we open to the audience about the status of women in Qatar. And I know from personal experience that women in the Gulf don't like Western women, much less American women, sort of parachuting into their societies and telling them how repressed they are and how they should be more like us. But I do. When I went to Saudi Arabia, I was 35 years old, and there was no Saudi woman who was my age could read or write, because there had been no public education. until 1963, the year the slaves were freed. So I know there's been huge educational and health advancement in the Gulf. And Qatar does a good job by the statistics on labor force participation, but it's still low by international standards. And I have a particular hobby horse, and that's inheritance. And I've seen over my 43-year career that inheritance in Latin America and the Arab world is absolutely key to women's advancement because it involves property, land, and it involves money. And once women have their hands on property and money, they're in a much better situation. So what is Qatar doing about that? The Tunisians are trying to basically get rid of Sharia law and impose a Western-style inheritance system and they have not succeeded so far, I hasten to add, because of the cultural barriers. So what is Qatar doing to sort of break down these religious and cultural barriers to women's advancement?
Once again, I mean, that's too many questions in one statement. I mean, so in terms of the percentage of women's participation in the labor workforce, I don't think in Qatar it's below the international, like...
probably not if you include Africa. Probably not if you include developing countries.
I mean, the percentage is 52%.
Yeah.
So that's a significant percent, as a matter of fact. So in the foreign ministry, 30% of our diplomats are females. So in Qatar, it's really a good percentage when it comes to that. 67% of higher education graduates are actually women. So we're outnumbering men in this case. So I think Qatar is doing fine when it comes to that. Yet, of course, just like any other society, you always have this glass ceiling, you always have some social constructs and so on and so forth. But I think this is changing, especially with more education, more awareness, and so on and so forth. And honestly, we have also forward-looking leadership. In terms of the second part of the question, and this is the most complicated one, I mean, Ambassador, you've used the term Sharia law, and this is a very contested term. And I personally don't know what it means and what it entails, right? We've been using it in the media a lot, but if you look historically into classic Islamic literature, the term Sharia law does not exist. It doesn't exist, right? You have things like what we call maqasid, the higher objectives of religion, and these are very flexible. As a matter of fact, they're somewhat equivalent of universal human rights and things like that. And of course, you have Islamic teachings. I mean, to give you the technical term, it's fiqh, it's Islamic jurisprudence. That's the technical term. And just like any other society, I mean, throughout history, philosophy and religion, up until the late 19th century, have always played a significant role in how societies govern themselves, how they thought about their problems, and so on and so forth. Muslim majority societies are not unique in this case. This applies to everyone. It wasn't until the late 19th century, early 20th century, that we started seeing this almost complete separation between philosophy, religion, and the big questions on the one hand, and then applied sciences and empirical sciences, etc. on the other hand. Of course, now we are seeing the resurgence of some of religious notions and calls to go back to maybe ideology, etc. and things like that, right? So along those lines, I would like to draw your attention to things that are often overlooked. So let's say Islamic jurisprudence, Islamic court system, historically, has been actually very flexible. I would like to refer you to a book written by an American historian. She's Jewish, by the way. Jessica Marlin, I think. Her book is called Across the Legal Lines. And it's the story of Muslims and the Jews in Morocco through the court system. So the court system, up until early 20th century, was quote-unquote Islamic. What does that mean? This is a question. According to Islamic jurisprudence, every community that is like non-Muslim communities, including Christians, Jewish community, etc., are allowed to refer to their own rules and regulations, right? So when she started tracing this back through archives, she found out that most Jewish merchants, late 19th century, early 20th century, although they had the choice to go to the Jewish court system in Morocco, they resorted to the Islamic court system for a number of reasons, including inheritance, by the way. Because my understanding is that a father is not allowed, a daughter wouldn't inherit her father, something like that. But according to Islamic jurisprudence, a daughter inherits, and so on and so forth. So things like that. My point is that some of these regulations and systems actually were very positive and played a very positive role, historically speaking. Why am I saying this? I'm saying this because we need to problematize many of the things that we hear. When we hear things like Sharia law or other things, this is not to say that we need to apply what has been applied in Morocco in the 19th century. This is just to say that there are different trajectories and different cultures and different, and each trajectory needs to take its course based on the factors and the context, both exogenous and internal dynamics factors as well.
Kim, shall we go to questions from the audience? There was a gentleman in the back who said I hoped for sure I would ask his question. Please go ahead.
Hi, Lolwah, I admire your courage. I came here to meet you mostly. My name is Ali Al-Yami, founder and director of the Center for Democracy and Human Rights in Saudi Arabia, here in Washington, D.C., because if I could do the same job I do here in Saudi Arabia, then we didn't need to discuss anything else. This group, the Women's Foreign Policy Group here, I have asked them, the organization, to organize a conference titled The Plight of Saudi Women. I have never got an answer, and since most of the audience here are females, and most of them probably are liberals, I think it's probably time to support our allies, which are the Saudi and Qatari and Egyptian and Pakistani women, who are actually the last hope for moving the Arab and Muslim countries forward. So I challenge everybody here to organize a conference, call it Plight of Saudi Women. My question to you, I'm not sure exactly, Lolwah, why I have to be careful here, because I'm trying to get some funding from the Qatari Foundation. What I do not understand is why are the Saudis and the Qataris, the Al Thani and Al Saud, are conflicting. They are Wahhabis, both of them. They are dictators. They fight their people. They invest very little money in human development. In fact, she talks about Ambassador Peterson, I think I heard her speaking about money spent on education in Saudi Arabia and somewhere else. The problem with the Saudi education, Arab in general, but Saudi educational system and the Qataris and the Gulfis is there is no freedom of expression within the universities. Books are censored. Most people are paid not to think, and therefore the education is useless as long as it is in that case. My question to Lolwah is this. Do you think it is best for the Gulf state people to have a united absolute dictators or fragmented absolute dictators?
Did you understand? Yeah, you understand? Okay.
I always believe in third tracks and third options, right? So I would I would like to challenge the way you portray the situation. There's a huge spectrum between totalitarianism, authoritarianism, and democracy, right? You may think of it as either or. Personally, I don't. I see a spectrum. To give you an example, Singapore, right? How do you define that?
Authoritarian.
Is it? Well, it must be a very progressive one then, right? So once again, you have many examples and models of governance. You mentioned freedom of expression in universities. I urge you and invite you to go to any of the universities in Doha and listen to the discussions and debates that take place, including discussions about monarchies and whether the Gulf should be be monarchies or democracies or things like that. This is the kind of discussion we have in our universities. So I think there are many differences and nuances when it comes to different countries in the region. And that's my answer.
Thank you. Next question. This gentleman right here. Then I'll move over here.
Thank you. Thank you for having us, and much to the chagrin of my colleague in the back, I'm not a liberal. So let me start. Thanks for having us. Great questions, Ambassador. Excellent. My question is for Her Excellency. The Trump administration, several days ago, recognized the Golan Heights as part of Israel after 52 years, when 2/3 of the Golan Heights effectively has been under Israeli government rule anyway. This has been met with outrage among some of the Arab neighbors. What is your government's official position on President Trump's decision, and what action will you take, Her Excellency, going forward? Thank you.
Thank you so much. The answer is very simple, straightforward. 2 official statements were issued by the government of Qatar. We joined our voice to the voice of the European Union, Germany, UK, the Arab League, the Gulf Cooperation Council, by the way. All of these have rejected that, and that's our position. It's against the international law. What's that?
Over here. Right here.
Hi. I wanted to switch gears a little bit, and I focus a lot in my work, Stefanie Foster, formerly at the State Department, with women and organizing women in the economy and politics. So I'm curious a little bit for you to maybe talk a little bit more about not only what the government is doing to push forward the role of women in Qatar, but sort of how civil society is engaged in that effort and how you all interact with civil society, which I can say as a former government person, sometimes you love them and sometimes they are kind of annoying, but they do play such a critical role in how we formulate policy and push forward an agenda. So I'd love it if you could respond to that a little bit. So thank you very much for being here.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So I would say that most of the discussion around women and women's rights and women empowerment, etc., is happening in universities. And honestly, sometimes I feel like I personally wear more than one hat when it comes to that. So there's a lot that's happening. I think that much of the discussion that's happening in universities and social media as well, especially Twitter, is helping us to push the limits, I should say, reminding the government, the society, that there are things that are yet to be done and achieved. But the Qatari society, remember, I mean, Ambassador Patterson said we're 300,000 people. So you wouldn't expect it to be maybe as very dynamic as it is in other contexts. But given the size, given the circumstances, I would say that we have a very good and healthy environment when it comes to that, mostly universities and social media.
There was a question, yeah, right back there.
Hi, my name's Elena. I'm with the Washington Institute. My question is about Yemen and Oman. So given your position vis-a-vis the Saudis and the Emiratis these days, you're in a little bit more of a difficult position than the Omanis, but probably the closest that any Gulf state has been to their position in terms of how you feel about the Saudis and the Emiratis, and then also your relationship with Iran. So if you could compare or contrast your relationship with Oman and maybe talk about whether it's become closer since this conflict, or just kind of what's going on in the Qatar-Omani bilateral relationship. And as a tag on to that, my understanding is that the Qataris and Omanis might be cooperating a bit in the Yemen sphere, again, in ways that are perhaps counter to the preferences of the Saudis and the Emiratis. And so I'm just wondering if you can talk a bit about your policy in Yemen and specifically how it might align with the Omanis' policy. Thanks.
Thank you. So the bilateral relationship between Qatar and Oman has been always good and excellent. Of course, after the blockade, there is like a new element added to this relationship, that is the trade. Qatar is now collaborating a lot with Oman in terms of renovating Oman's port, because now we rely a lot on Oman to import goods to Qatar. And I would say that this is the main development when it comes to the bilateral relationship. Oman and Qatar and Yemen, I cannot think of an example. Our position towards Yemen, we were part of the coalition when it started, with the understanding that this was going to be a 3-week thing, a very limited operation. But unfortunately, I mean, we're 3 years down the road. The situation there is catastrophic. The humanitarian crisis is just beyond anyone's comprehension. And if anyone can tell me what the objective is currently in Yemen, please, I mean, do, because I don't understand it. It has become a very nihilistic situation. I mean, who's fighting whom? For what purpose? No one knows. And that's why this war needs to end, because it's pointless.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you both for a very interesting and challenging discussion. I have also a challenge. I'm Anna Mary Ports. I'm currently with the Coalition to Defeat ISIS. And now that Qatar, a founding member of the coalition, can celebrate with us in part the end of the caliphate, we are faced with an enormous challenge, and that is the women and children who have been affiliated either as family members, intentionally or inadvertently. If we don't deal with the challenge now, this is the possibility for ISIS in the future. Would you share your thoughts? And following up on this evening, can we count on Qatar to help us be part of that solution? Thank you.
I totally agree with this assessment. This is what we've been saying. Violent extremism is a phenomenon that needs to be uprooted, in the sense that we need to start thinking about treating the roots of this phenomenon, and also the factors that kind of facilitated, right? Some of these routes are socioeconomic. I mean, we focus a lot sometimes on the ideological, cultural element. Fair enough, that's definitely a main thing. But also the socioeconomic and political factors are important here. Our answer to this is the solution needs to be holistic. In Syria, there needs to be transitional justice as well. As long as the same regime is in place, as long as all the injustices are in place, these people will always find a substance to capitalize on, to recruit others, to convince them. And this will be an empty circle. That's why, yes, Qatar is willing to engage. As a matter of fact, there was in Brussels that meeting to help Syria. Qatar was the only, with the exception of Jordan and Lebanon, which are receiving countries when it comes to the refugees, with the exception of these countries, Qatar was the only country there. And the only country that contributed financially. So once again, we remain very committed, but there needs to be a plan. Rewarding the regime by restoring relations is definitely not an answer. And this is happening, unfortunately. So we need to think of this holistically, and Qatar is willing to be part of that solution, as long as it's a holistic solution that looks at all the factors in a very multifaceted way.
Could I ask you a question? I think our audience might be interested. I've read that the number of ISIS women and children, there were a lot more there than anyone thought because they were dug in Baghouz. How many people are we talking about, do you think?
Thank you. We know for a fact that the camp at Al-Hol, which regrettably was in the open source media today because of an incident among the women between the Iraqi foreign fighter community, the ISIS foreign fighter, and the Syrian women in that instance. That population is 70,000, wow. And we estimate that approximately 90% are women and children. That's only one of several camps.
How many camps? 7 camps?
Several. We're in negotiations with the SDF to be exactly sure, and some of the early camps were in fact prisons where they were holding the ISIS fighters. So we're dealing with enormous populations. We're also dealing with what we call internally displaced populations in Iraq, where we also have some programming that has to be done with sensitivity, because those women and children who inadvertently came out of communities that ISIS was holding sometimes continue to bear the stigma and have difficulty even returning to their normal lives.
Follow this with a question, actually. So most of these, if I may ask, just to follow most of these people are like Syrians, Iraqis, or they come from other, do we have percentages? Because that makes a difference. I mean,
I can't provide those numbers right now, but I'm certainly happy to follow up with you. They're largely Syrian and Iraqi, but there are also representatives from, I believe it's 43 countries currently. Only a handful of countries have begun to take back their fighters. Initially, primarily, they're willing to take back the actual ISIS fighters because it's perhaps somewhat easier to prosecute and contain them and provide the right sentencing for the crimes they've committed. For the women, it's much more difficult, and if they're in refugee camps where their countries can't access them, then there is no possibility for the normal consular activity.
Yeah. Question in the back. Gentleman in the back.
Hi, my name is Mansour Al-Haj. I would like to ask about Al Jazeera and the anti-American narrative that is being broadcast every day on Al Jazeera, and the pro-jihadism and Hamas discourse that I've seen every day. And up until 2011, Al Jazeera was not did not criticize Saudi Arabia at all. And now after the blockade and the Jamal Khashoggi death, we see overwhelming reports against Saudi Arabia. So I, as an American, I'm very curious why Al Jazeera keeps the anti-American narrative.
Well, I cannot speak for Al Jazeera. I'll speak about Al Jazeera, but not for Al Jazeera in this case. Just as someone who watches Al Jazeera, I would say. What I know is that Al Jazeera hosts both sides when it comes to the United States. Sometimes people from the administration, and please correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, people from the administration, people from the other side, etc. So. As a viewer, it's very difficult for me to portray Al Jazeera as anti-American. Likewise, the other side of the question, that it is promoting, is it violent extremism, or is this what you're saying? Jihadism? Once again, I mean, providing specific examples would be helpful. The example that is often brought up is some interviews, but let us all remember that it was the CNN who was first to interview Bin Laden, right, in the 1997, 98, something like that. So once again, no one accused CNN at the time. Now, this could be an ethical question. Personally, I might have an ethical question, but it's within the area of media ethics, the ethics of media, rather than a question about whether they support or not. So I don't think so. I mean, as a matter of fact, when the blockading countries demanded that the Al Jazeera gets shut down or shuttered, the United States, many human rights groups rejected that completely. No one accepted that. I mean, so this in itself, I think, speaks for the fact that it's not doing what was mentioned in the question. There was a third element in the question which I cannot.
The pro-Muslim Brotherhood agenda of Al Jazeera.
No, actually, I remember. We'll come to that, but now I remember. You mentioned Saudi. As a matter of fact, around 2002, 2003, Saudi withdrew its ambassador from Qatar for 7 years because of Al Jazeera. So it's not true that post the blockade things have, as you said, things have changed. Muslim Brotherhood, once again, I mean, you will see all sorts of views being expressed on Al Jazeera, including, I mean, only recently there was pro-Assad figure who was in Doha actually saying that Qatar supports terrorism in Syria. I mean, he said that on Al Jazeera, right? Human Rights Watch, just a few days after, actually July 2017, just after the blockade, the director of Human Rights Watch was in Doha, and he was on Al Jazeera criticizing Qatar and the conditions of guest workers, etc. So I would actually question that.
So the U.S. government over the years has really been irritated by what plays on Al Jazeera, but fundamentally it comes back to freedom of the press. It's an overriding principle of our democracy, and it doesn't just apply here, but it applies elsewhere in the world. Yeah. More questions? Yes.
Well, thank you both for an excellent discussion, Your Excellency and Ambassador. I'm Kent Hughes from the Woodrow Wilson Center, and I shared your concern about getting to root causes. What are the 3 things you'd like the United States to do that would help you and others get at those root causes?
Do you understand?
Sure, that's a very good question. So one thing for sure is, how to put it in a very nice way.
Be blunt.
There has been a formula in the Arab region that, we support the dictator And in return, the dictator ensures that there is stability, right? Unfortunately, this formula is what created, at least partly, many of these groups that we see today. So if there was one recommendation that I would give, please don't apply this formula. It doesn't work. I mean, it just covers up the injury, but then it doesn't heal it. So that's one thing. The other thing is to think of the question of violent extremism in a holistic manner. Just to give you an example, we had a meeting, I will not mention where and who was the person who made that comment, but it was a person who was essentially involved in the fight against ISIS. And he said, you know, we've done our part. They lost their territories. It's for you now, Muslims, to figure it out. It doesn't work this way, right? I mean, engagement, long-term engagement in the post-conflict period is very important. Transitional justice to ensure that you know, there is sustainability and continuity. This is very important. I don't know if I can think of a third thing, but these would be the top two things that I can recommend.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, right there.
Hi, Kate Bauer from the Washington Institute. This was raised earlier, Qatar's support for Gaza over time, reportedly close to $1 billion since 2012. A lot of that has gone to projects, payment of salaries, more recently job programs, but also to support fuel for electricity. That assistance is reportedly set to run out in April, and I'm wondering if we can expect Qatar to continue to support fuel purchases in Gaza.
As you rightly put it, I mean, the contract, the agreement ended or will end in April. There are discussions undergoing now, and we realize that there is a need for that. And I mean, I did mention earlier that Qatar also supports projects in West Bank, etc. These are worth almost like $600 million. So it's a significant number as well.
Thank you very much for being here today, for answering your questions so forthrightly. I'm Dawn Calabia from Refugees International. My question is, in many parts of the Arab world, women are not able to pass their nationality if they marry a non-citizen. And I was wondering, we've raised this question in Qatar in the past, and there was talk about possibly making some changes, because we think it's a really important thing for women to be able to follow their hearts and marry who they wish, and protect their children's inheritances. Thank you.
Absolutely. That's a very good question, and as a woman, I join my voice to you, to be honest. There have been some changes in the policy recently. So children of Qatari women don't yet have the right to get the citizenship. However, they're treated just like Qataris when it comes to health insurance, when it comes to schooling, job opportunities, etc. So this is a development, it's progress, but I totally agree there's yet to be, much to be done.
Let women marry who they wish.
Fair enough.
One more question, I think. Kim is, huh?
Close it.
What?
Just to close it, I think.
Okay, one more question, and then we'll close it out. Yes. The young lady in the middle there.
Hi, my name is Jennifer with U.S. Chamber of Commerce. I was wondering if you could speak to some of the economic reforms Qatar's undertaken over the last year, and also how the situation with Qatar's neighbor affects the average person in Qatar. And then lastly, if you could comment on the Middle East Strategic Alliance discussions and Qatar's position, if you see any hope for reconciling differences.
I thought, Ambassador, you said one question. These are two questions. That's okay. So, economic reforms, the major thing is that Qatar has diversified its supply chains. So as I mentioned, 90% of the food, medicine, many of the goods, including the construction material, used to come through United Arab Emirates or Saudi. This is no longer the case. Now we get much of our food supplies and other things from countries like Azerbaijan, Turkey, Australia is becoming more and more important for us when it comes to food security, Africa, etc. So, and we're not depending on one country. This is now the policy. In addition to this and that, we just inaugurated the energy plant, which is supposed to secure us when it comes to energy and also water desalination. The plant currently, I mean, we're now storing food in big containers. So according to the plan, even if something happens, we can survive for 2 years with food and enough food supplies and water and so on and so forth. Your second question was about
how the embargo was affecting the average Qatari.
The average, yeah, absolutely. So in the very beginning of this blockade, everyone panicked, etc. What happened, of course, shipping goods to the country through aircrafts, etc., was much expensive, much more expensive, sorry. But the government actually absorbed the cost so that this will not affect ordinary people, including, by the way, the guest workers. So there were certain selling points that were dedicated only for guest workers to make sure that they're not affected whatsoever. Your third question was about the Arab NATO. I mean, sometimes it's called MESA, sometimes Arab NATO. What was the question, though?
What's Qatar's position and
Absolutely. I mean, Qatar engaged in all of the discussions that happened, and there was a meeting, if you remember, last September with Secretary Pompeo and the foreign ministers of the GCC countries. Honestly, I mean, those discussions are still happening. We're not seeing anything that is materializing from these discussions, but we made it very clear. I mean, how is it possible to forge an alliance between countries that don't have any diplomatic ties? It's not possible.
So I want to thank everybody for coming, and particularly the ambassador for spending so much time with us, and again, thank the Women's Foreign Policy Group for yet another